In today's video, we're going to review chapters 3 and 4, which dealt with decimals. Our objective: while completing the chapter 3 and 4 quiz, the students will summarize and apply the skills covered in these chapters and successfully complete 8 out of 10 questions. Our essential question: what have we learned in chapter 3 and 4 to be successful with identifying decimal place value, comparing and ordering decimals, adding, subtracting, and multiplying decimals? So probably the best way to begin this lesson or to review this lesson is to show you our decimal place value chart. All right, to review our decimal places. We begin first all the way to the left, which is our ones. These are actually whole numbers. We have ones, and if we had more room here, you'd have ones, tens, hundreds, and so on. Here's your decimal. Now to the right, we have our decimal places: tenths, hundreds, and thousands. Now in 5th grade, we only go down to thousands. We don't have to worry about 10,000, so we're going to ignore that for now. All right. So probably the best way to model the values of these numbers is probably to show you base 10 blocks. We have ones, we have tenths, and we have hundreds, and I don't have anything small enough to represent thousands. But you notice that as you move to the left of the place value chart, the numbers are getting bigger, or the values are getting bigger. Actually, they're getting 10 times bigger. So a tenths is 10 times bigger than a hundreds, and a ones is 10 times bigger than a tenths. And as you move to the right, the numbers are getting smaller. So the tenths is 1/10 smaller than the ones, and the hundreds is 1/10 smaller than the tenths. So you get 10 times bigger as you move to the left, and 1/10 of as you move to the right. Okay? Another way of showing you the values of this is probably to also show you with money. So we have a dollar bill, which will represent the one spot. We have a dime to represent the tenths, and we have a penny to represent the hundreds. And in our number system, we don't have any number or any value of number of money that is small enough to represent thousands, just to show you how small thousands really are. Okay? So one possible question that you might receive when in regards to this is, what is the value of the 7 in 745 thousandths? So if we look at our decimal place value chart, we're going to use this and we're going to write this number, or actually this number on here. So we have 0, a decimal point, 745. So we have 745 thousandths. Now, the question is, what is the value of the 7? Well, if you look at the decimal place value chart, the 7 is in the tenth spot. Therefore, the value of that 7 would be 7 tenths. So what I would like for you to do is to look at number 1 on your quiz. Quiz 2, number 1. The question there states, what is the value of the 8 in 283 thousandths? So what I would like for you to do is to pause this video, answer question number 1 based off what I've just modeled for you here, and then once you're ready to move on to number 2, you can hit play. Okay, another type of question is that they might ask you to identify a digit in a certain place. So for this question, it says, name the digit in the hundredths place. The decimal number is 3 and 249 thousandths. So if I go back to my decimal place value chart, I could write that in. 3 and 249 thousandths. So by looking at our decimal place value, the number in the hundredths spot is definitely the digit 4. Okay, so if you look at your quiz, number 2 states, name the digit in the thousandths place. And the decimal is 9 and 416 thousandths. I want you to press pause on the video and press play when you're ready to move on to number 3. One of the skills that we also worked on between chapters 3 and 4 is being able to compare decimal numbers. So in this number, there's two numbers, and we want to select a greater number. We have 3 and 834 thousandths, and underneath of that, we have 3 and 85 hundredths. Now, one of the things that I want to show you, and this is already done for us, but I want you to see that the best way to compare decimal numbers is not side by side. It is best to line them up one on top of the other and lining up our decimal places right underneath each other. Therefore, you have the ones with the ones, the tenths with the tenths, the hundredths with the hundredths, and the thousands with the thousands. And you're going to notice that there's an empty spot here in the thousand spot. What many people like to do is so the numbers can be even, the same amount of digits, you can place a 0 at the end, and it doesn't change the value of this number. But now it's a lot easier to compare. And we always begin by comparing the greater value first. Now, the greatest value, remember, always begin all the way to the left. In this case, is the ones. So what we want to do is compare the ones and the ones. So it happens they're the same. So far, these decimals are equal to each other. Move on to the tenths. Tenths and this tenths are the same. Now, you're going to notice that when you get to the hundredth spot, that is the first place where the digits are different. Now, the 5 is greater than the 3. Therefore, 3 and 85 hundredths is greater than 3 and 834 thousandths. So our answer here will be 3 and 85 hundredths. And you could ignore the 0. You could drop the 0 there. So if you look at your quiz, number 3 says to select the greater number. Once again, if you want, make sure, I encourage you to write the numbers on one at the top, one at the bottom, and line up your decimals, add zeros where you need to. Press pause and press play once you've answered that question. Another skill covered in chapters 3 and 4 is rounding decimals. So here's an example. We're going to round 27 and 83 hundredths to the nearest tenth. Now, there's a couple steps that I'd like for you to follow as you go along here. And here are your steps. The first thing is I recommend you underline the digit that you want to round to. So in this case, we want to round to the nearest tenth. I will underline the digit that's in the 10th spot. That is your 8th, right? Your 8 is in the 10th spot, that is. So we have ones, tenths, hundredths. Thousands would be here. So we're underlining the digit 8, which is in the 10th spot. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to look to the right of that number. Okay, so we look to the right of that number. Now that number is a 3. We move on to step 3. It says 0 to 4 stays as before. 5 through 9 goes up the line. So that 3 is between 0 through 4. Therefore, that 3 is going to tell that 8 to remain the same. It does not move up the line. So our answer here would be 27 and 8 tenths. If you wanted to, you could add a 0 at the end, or you could leave it alone. You could leave it blank. Our answer here will be 27 and 8 tenths. So take a look at your quiz. And for number 4, it says to round 46 and 54 hundredths to the nearest tenth. Please follow the steps. If you want, you could pause the video at that spot and you could remember the steps and press play once you've answered that. Continuing with comparing decimals. In this particular question, they want us to name the least number. Now, you're going to notice that these decimals, there's 4 decimals put together side by side, separated by a semicolon. Now, once again, like I encouraged you to do earlier, it is best to compare decimals not side by side, but by lining them up from top to bottom and lining up our decimals. So I'm first put this first one, which is 7 and 5 hundredths. Then I'm going to put 7 and 2 tenths. Notice my decimals are lined up, and I have a 2 in the 10th spot. Then I'm going to move on to 7 and 25 hundredths. And finally, 7 and 4 hundredths. Now they're all lined up, ones with the ones, tenths with the tenths, hundredths with the hundredths. You're going to notice that there's an empty spot here. As I told you earlier, many people like to put a 0 there to hold its spot. Now, once again, when you want to compare numbers, always start off all the way to the highest valued number, which in this case is the 1 spot, and begin to then follow along until you get to the, now here we're looking for the smallest number, right? So we look at our ones, we notice that they're all the same in the ones. We go to the 10th spot. Now we're looking for the smallest number. So automatically we know that these 2s are not going to work for what we're looking for because a 2 is greater than these 2 zeros. So going to the top and the bottom here, we notice that these 2 are both the same. So it doesn't really help us yet. It helped us in that we eliminated these 2 in the middle, but it doesn't help us to find out which is the smallest of all these yet. So now we move on to the 100 spot. We have a 5 and a 4, which are both different, right? That 4 is smaller than the 5. Therefore, this would be your final answer. 7 and 4 hundredths is the smallest number. Now, what I wanted to show you real quick is that many students might rush and think that 7 and 2 tenths might be the smallest number because there's less digits. But in reality, this is your smallest number, even though it has more digits. But remember that as you go to the right of the decimal place value, those numbers really don't have a lot of value to it, right? This is a 10th spot. These are hundreds. This hundreds is worth 1/10 of this, all right? So it's 1/10 smaller than these numbers here. So these numbers here are not worth too much. So you put a 0 here, you could definitely tell that this 0 is less than that one. So for number 5 on your quiz, it says to name the least number. Now you have 9 and 8 hundredths, 9 and 1/10, 9 and 15 hundredths, and 9 and 6 hundredths. I recommend that you do the same thing that I did here. Line them up from top to bottom. Make sure your decimals are lined up. Put zeros in between if you have to, and find the smallest number. Press pause on your video, and when you're ready, you can hit play. Another skill that we worked on is being able to identify a term, an unknown term in a sequence. So here you have your sequence. You have 43 and 9/10, 43 and 6/10, 43 and 3/10. You have an empty spot where we're going to find an unknown term, and then you have 42 and 7/10. Now, once again, here are rules on how to find an unknown term in a sequence. The first thing you want to do is you always want to subtract the 2 numbers that are right next to each other. They got to be next to each other. So I have a couple options here. I could decide to subtract these 2 numbers because they're right next to each other, or I could subtract these 2 numbers because once again, they're right next to each other. I cannot subtract these 2 numbers because there's an empty spot here where we're going to put an unknown term here. So these numbers are actually not next to each other. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and subtract the first 2 numbers that are right next to each other. So 43 and 9/10. And we're going to subtract 43 and 6/10. Make sure you line up your decimals. When you add or subtract decimals, your decimals must always be lined up. Okay? So 9 minus 6 is 3. We could drop our decimal down. 3 minus 3 is 0. And 4 minus 4 is 0. So we found a rule. Now we haven't found, that's not the number that goes on here, because if we go to step 2, something else that we have to identify now is the pattern. Is the pattern increasing, meaning going up, right? In that case, we would add. Or is the pattern decrease? Decreasing means it's going down. In that case, we would subtract. So we go back to here. Now we notice we started with 43 and 9/10. Then we went to 43 and 6/10. That 6 is less than the 9. This term is decreasing. So when we're decreasing, that means we're going to have to subtract. So we're going to identify a rule. Now, I know that we're going to subtract. Now, what are we going to subtract by? Well, let's go back to here. When we subtracted these 2 numbers, we came up with 3/10. I'm going to drop the 0 here. We don't necessarily need that. So our rule is to subtract 3/10. Now, step number 4 is that we're going to apply that rule. So we know that the number before the empty spot here is 43 and 3/10. So I'm going to put that number right here, 43 and 3/10. And I'm going to apply the rule that we found, which is to subtract 3/10. And I'm going to subtract 3/10 from 43 and 3/10. Once again, when we add or subtract decimal numbers, we always line up our decimals. Be sure of that. Okay? So now that they're lined up, I can subtract them. 3 minus 3 is 0. Drop your decimal in the same spot. 3 minus 0 is 3, and the 4 can be dropped down. Our answer is 43.0, which is the same as 43. It's a whole number, right? So I'd go to the top here, and I would write my number as 43. If you wanted to, means the same thing. You could put a decimal and a 0. Now, if you go to number 6 on your quiz, same type of question. It says, what is the unknown term in this sequence? You have 35 and 9/10, 34 and 7/10, 33 and 5/10. You have an empty spot, and you have 31 and 1/10. Please be sure to follow the steps as outlined on here. Subtract two numbers that are right next to each other. Decide whether the pattern is increasing or decreasing. Write down your rule, and then apply the rule. Press pause, and when you're ready to move on to number 7, you could hit play. Okay, so for this question, sort of similar to what we did before, which is smaller. We have 7 and 84 hundredths, and we have 7 and 420 thousandths. So once again, when we compare decimals, make sure you line them up, decimals on top of decimals, right? And if you wanted to, you go back and find any empty spots. You're going to notice in the thousand spot, there's nothing here. You could add a 0. It doesn't change our value. Still stays the same. Now, remember, when you compare, always begin all the way to the left to the highest valued number. In this case, is in the 1 spot. And you can notice the 7 or 7, well, they're the same. So it doesn't really help us yet. But we're going to notice that once you get to the 10 spot, that is the first place where the digits are different. We're looking for the smaller number. The 4 is smaller than the 8. Therefore, our answer here would be 7 and 420 thousandths is less than 7 and 840 thousandths. If you look at number 7 on your quiz, it says, which is smaller? Same type of deal. Make sure you line up your decimals, add zeros if you need it to hold the spot. Start up to the left and begin to find out where the digits are different and find a smaller number. Press pause, and when you're ready, you could hit play to begin again. Okay, so for the next skill is a simple subtraction of decimals. We're going to solve 51 and 74 hundredths, and we're going to subtract 32 and 3/10 from that. Now, I touched upon this earlier, and I told you that when we add or subtract decimals, we want to make sure our decimals are lined up one on top of the other. Okay, so we're going to start off with this number. We're going to put 51 and 74 hundredths. And underneath of that, I'm going to put 32 and 3/10, making sure my decimal is in the right spot. 32 and 3/10. And you can put your subtraction sign. And you're going to notice that there's an empty spot here. As we told you earlier, when comparing decimals, you could put a 0 to hold the spot because it doesn't change our value. Now, once we've done that, we can subtract. 4 minus 0 is just 4. 7 minus 3 is 4. 1 minus 2, well, we can't do that, so we must borrow from the 10 spot. 5 becomes a 4, and that 1 will become an 11. 11 minus 2 is 9, and 4 minus 3 is 1. Okay? Decimals are all lined up. You drop it like it's hot. Our answer is 19 and 44 hundredths. So if you look back on your quiz, number 8 on your quiz says 32 and 56 hundredths minus 29 and 4/10. Make sure you line up your, I can't stress that enough. Make sure you line up your decimals, add zeros if you need to, and subtract. Make sure to borrow on any particular problem that you might have to. Press pause and play once you're ready. Okay, for our next problem, we're going to be asked to solve 35 times 3 and 5/10. Now, this is the first time that we've seen multiplication here. Now, earlier, I told you that when we add or subtract, that we have to line up decimals. Well, we don't do that when we multiply decimals. In fact, I encourage you not to because it'll just confuse you. So we are not worrying about having to line up decimals here. In fact, there's no decimal in 35. So we put 35 on top, and we're going to put 3 and 5/10 underneath of that. Once again, we're not going to worry about lining up decimals when we multiply. That's only when you add or subtract decimals. So we set our problem up this way. And now we're going to ignore the decimal for now. We're going to ignore the decimal. We're going to multiply as we normally would with whole numbers. So we're going to go 5 times 5. That's 25. Then we're going to do 5 times 3. That gives us 15. We're going to add the 2 that we carried over. It gives us 17. So I am now done with the 2 that I carried over, and I'm done with this 5. I could now go ahead and multiply the 3, but before I do that, I must put a 0 to hold its spot here. Now I can continue as regular. 3 times 5, that's 15. I carry my 1, put my 5 down. Then I do 3 times 3, that's 9, plus 1 more is 10. Now we're going to add up our partial products. 5 plus 0 is 5, 7 plus 5 is 12, and 1 plus 1 that I carried over is 2, and I put the 1 down. Now I worry about the decimal point. I didn't worry about it when I was multiplying, but now I do. We don't just drop it down like we did when we were adding and subtracting. We're going to scoop out, then we're going to scoop in the same amount of numbers that I had scooped out. So for this case, I'm going to scoop out 1 time. Okay, so I did 1 scoop, right, to the right. Now I scooped it out. Now I'm going to scoop back in the same amount of time, 1 time. So I'm going to scoop in 1 time. This is scoop out. This is scoop in. I'm going to scoop in 1 time, beginning from here, 1 time over. My decimal would be right here. And my answer is 122 and 5/10. So if you look at your quiz or your problem, your test, it says, number 9 says 27 times 3 and 5/10. Once again, we don't worry about having to line up decimal points, okay? We don't line them up. We multiply it as usual with like whole numbers. We ignore the decimal until we get to our final answer. And make sure you scoop out the correct amount of times, and then you scoop back in the correct amount of times. Press pause in your video, and when you are done working on number 9, you can hit play to move on. Okay, so for our final question, we have a word problem. Okay, so let's start off by reading the word problem. Linda works at Walmart. She worked 17 hours this week. Last week, she worked 1 and 5/10 times as many hours as she worked this week. How many hours did Linda work last week? So what do we know? What information did the problem give us that we already know? Well, we know that she worked 17 hours this week, okay? And we also know that last week she worked 1 and 5 times as many hours. What do we want to find out? Well, the question at the bottom is, how many hours did Linda work last week? Okay, so if we go back, there is one word that tells us which operation we're going to use. What word do you think that is? If you said times, you are correct. Times means that we're going to multiply. So we're going to multiply 17 times 1 and 5/10. As I told you earlier, when we multiply, we do not line up decimals, okay? So we put our 17 top, and then at the bottom, we're going to put 1 and 5/10. Once again, not worrying about having to line up decimals. And we're going to ignore the decimal for now. We're going to multiply as we normally would with whole numbers. So we're going to go 5 times 7, that's 35. I carry the 3, put the 5 down. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 3 more is 8. I am done with the 3 that I carried over, and I am done with that 5. But before I move on to that 1, I got to put a 0 as a placeholder. Now I can multiply. 1 times 7 is 7, and 1 times 1 is 1. Once I have my partial products, I can add them. So we have 5 plus 0 is 5. 8 plus 7 is 15. I carry the 1, put the 5 down, and 1 plus 1 is 2. Now we go back and we scoop out the decimal and we scoop in the decimal. So in this case, we're going to scoop out 1 time. 1. Scoop out. We're going to scoop in the same amount of time, which is 1 time. So we're going to scoop in 1 time. So we start from here. We move it 1 place to the left. Our decimal point would be here. Our answer is 25 and 5/10. So let's take a look at number 10 on your quiz. Number 10 states, Patrick works at ShopRite. He worked 15 hours this week. Last week, he worked 2 and 5, 10 times as many hours as he worked this week. How many hours did Patrick work last week? Be sure to underline the things that we know that the problem told us. And then what do we want to find out? What is the question? And circle that one word that tells us which operation we're going to use. Okay? Good luck, boys and girls.